Welcome to the 2 Degrees C Climate Chat podcast, your weekly guide to what's happening within the climate around the world. My name is Neil Vinnikirk, the Executive Director and a founding member of 2 Degrees C. Along with co-founders Dr. Carsten Schewe and Jenny Dissen, we cover issues relating to the climate crisis. So join us as we explore in the 2 Degrees C Climate Chat. Welcome back to the 2 Degrees C Climate Chat podcast. Our guest today is Jeremy Schewe. He's the Chief Scientific Officer and co-founder of Ecobot. Jeremy has used his ecology and botany background to develop a software that offers a change in the way that environmental field work is performed. Joining me today to interview Jeremy are 2 Degrees C co-founders, Jenny Dissen and Dr. Carsten Schewe. Okay, Carsten, so before we bring Jeremy into the conversation, I had a question with regard to wetlands and carbon sequestration and how methane release from those areas impacts the climate in the overall scheme.
Thanks, Neil. The idea of methane, it's in the atmosphere, is really one of the more potent greenhouse gases, about, I would say, 25 times more potent than carbon dioxide for the same concentration. It's a lot lower concentration than CO2, but again, can have an outsized impact. And the wetlands are actually a pretty large source of methane. I think they account for about a third of all methane emissions worldwide. And this just happens as things decompose in the water and such, and methane is produced. What we're seeing though is that as high latitude permafrost areas are starting to thaw, they're becoming wetlands, and they're adding to some of the emissions that are coming out in these areas, and really exacerbating the climate crisis.
And we're concerned about methane specifically because of its heating properties, correct?
That's right. It's far more effective at intercepting and re-radiating heat energy.
Well, let's welcome our guest today is Jeremy Schewe. He's the Chief Scientific Officer and co-founder of Ecobot. So welcome, Jeremy.
Thank you, Nick.
You're welcome. So, Jeremy, let's have you introduce yourself to the listeners and to maybe describe your bio for us.
Sure. Yeah. So my background is in forest ecology and plant taxonomy, and I've had a specific interest and focus on sensitive areas and sensitive habitats for the majority of my career. Very strong interest in spray cliff communities, cloud forests, wetlands, and sort of karst regions. I like places where I'm drawn to places that are edge places, and edge places, of course, as ecotones, are a place where so many different life cycles cross and mingle and meet together. So you have high amounts of biodiversity, and you also have fantastic amounts of nutrient availability. And so all of the great action is happening in these ecotones. And frequently the edges of these ecotones are where a lot of the really sensitive communities are that are more at risk because of whatever it might be, whether it's anthropogenic, or if it's just encroachment of other species, or things that may be changing as the climate shifts. Like, all of these come to play in sensitive habitats. So I worked with the University of North Carolina for a number of years at a biological research station in the Southern Appalachian Mountains, and then was drawn very quickly into the consulting world, working with threatened and endangered species assessments, conservation planning, NEPA-related work, wetlands and stream assessments, and restoration projects. So pretty interesting and work that's very fulfilling to me on a very heart as well as the mental basis. So I get to touch the passion inside, but also the scientist that is equally as important to me in the 21st century. So then, let's see, 3 years ago, started Ecobot based on my experience in the field. Just seeing a lot of opportunity to ramp up some of the natural resources monitoring into the 21st century, utilizing technology and geospatial science dovetailed together with boots on the ground and with some of the remote sensing capabilities that are now available to scientists, and be able to bring that together into a really concise, usable tool that scientists are using to help with their monitoring and assessments of wetlands in North America.
That's great. So you're a wetland specific scientist. So maybe you can start by explaining, what wetland science consists of, and why that's important with regard to the climate conversation.
Well, I think it's like anything, Neil, in 21st century where we have an opportunity to focus into such niche environments where we can look specifically at hyper-specific observations. So let me dive back into your question now. So wetland science is a very broad topic because you're going to have people that are in the regulatory and policy side. You're going to have people that are in the monitoring, for changes over time side. Then you're going to have people that are hyper-specific on assessments. So that's, in the science and policy section. But then you're also going to be looking at people in wetland science that are also tied to geologists when you're dealing with mineral rights and acquisitions. You're dealing with, some of the things that Karsten may work with when you're dealing with dispersion of various pollutants and gases and how those impact an ecosystem. And so within wetland science, there's also a fair amount of monitoring of how do pollutants or how do temperatures change things. One of the projects I've been involved with for years is actually similar to what Karsten spoke to before, is monitoring of wetlands in the Arctic up in northern Scandinavia, and looking to see how some of the more southern species that are less hardy are slowly migrating north, and how that permafrost is thawing out to deeper levels and allowing all of those organics to get a little bit of interchange with the gases from the atmosphere, which then are being released. So yeah, there's all kinds of amazing ways that people engage. And so I'm a member of the Society for Wetland Scientists, international organization, a lot of great scientists and business folks and policy folks in that organization. And so my focus, of course, is mostly on the monitoring and assessment side of things.
Right. Now, these wetlands, they provide quite they promote biodiversity in the form of providing a haven for species, whether it be birds or other wildlife. But there's also an impact relating to the way city architecture is done and infrastructure. Can you perhaps help us understand that?
Sure. Yeah. So one of the things that I see happening more and more with some of the larger urban areas is the utilization for wetlands as, potentially as like living stormwater retention. Some of the smaller municipalities out Karsten's way, as well as in some European countries, are experimenting with the utilization of wetland ecosystems, like simulated wetland ecosystems for wastewater management, but also for carbon sequestration. I think that when looking at the interaction of wetlands and cities, a lot of cities, of course, there's growth, there's the desire to, in some places, potentially fill in wetlands and turn them into habitable areas. In other areas, you see a really strong focus in working with the existing habitat and how can that enhance the human and nature interchange. And so I think that there's a tremendous opportunity, between like wetland conservation, wetland enhancement, wetland restoration, in a very similar niche as like living roofs and doing like, green walls, allowing for the natural vegetation to help with the cooling that you get from some of the heat island effects in some of the urban areas. So I think that was probably in a broad context is what answer you there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think wetlands really are a really critical part of natural infrastructure, and they filter a lot of runoff and such that would otherwise wind up in the oceans.
I mean, to me, it's fascinating how much biogenic as well as anthropogenic feedback that a wetland gives. I mean, we've kind of talked a little bit about the very large sort of landscape level biogenic side of it, but from the human side, yes, like the filtration of nutrients, the filtration of sediments, the buffering of semi-solid waste. There's some very practical elements to it as well. And one of the things, I mean, I might sidestep a little bit just for a moment, but like with recent revamping of protected waters of the United States rules under the Clean Water Act by our previous administration, you can really see this like sort of pendulum or ping pong effect of like really trying to determine where streams or wetlands start and stop. And it's one of these things that's kind of like, where do my veins start and stop? Like we can create a map, but once we get into the capillary action, there's so much. Like if we remove all the capillaries from our human body, we won't function. But that's essentially what some of the revamping of waters of the United States rules is looking at. And so when I look at like where I grew up in Ohio, there's all these massive upland areas that were at one time forested wetlands that most people don't even think of as wetlands. And so that's one thing I'll just put in as a pitch is like, everybody knows what a saltwater estuary looks like. Everybody knows what the Everglades look like, but most people don't realize is that they've got a wetlands in their backyard. And it might be because it's just a seasonal wetland. Maybe it's only inundated for 2 or 3 weeks for a month, but the amount of water storage that those soils and that forest might have, and then as it slowly releases that water, like you remove that and put in even pervious surfaces, all that water is rushing through and then dumping into our streams. Mm-hmm. And so all of the wetlands have a really critical role, from the most seemingly upland most humans would not associate as being a wetland to the most obvious, yay, look at the alligators and the big birds in the Everglades, Yeah.
Described barefoot luxury, the casually sophisticated Southern Cross Club is Little Cayman's original resort. This hidden gem is as unique and vibrant as the island it inhabits. A true island treasure, it is the perfect place to dive, fish, and relax. Its 14 beachfront bungalows are situated on 900 feet of white sand, only minutes from the world-class diving found only in Little Cayman. Visit www.southerncrossclub.com to book your escape to tranquility. So Jenny, how is it that you came to know Jeremy? How did you guys find each other?
Yeah, thanks, Neil, for asking. Well, I've come across Ecobot at this place called the Collider, which is located in Asheville. Collider's a gathering, a think tank of climate experts, environmental experts, and those that are interested in the talking about climate environmental issues and how to mainstream solutions, both from public and private and academic arenas. And so Collider houses a number of companies, establishments, and it's a member-driven organization. And Ecobot happens to be one of them. So they were presenting at a coffee hour, and I had a chance to meet Jeremy and Lee, and they were talking about wetlands. So as an environmental engineer, I don't have a lot of other folks to talk about these topics. So that's how it started. We rubbed elbows at a climate think tank venue. So Jeremy, it's great to connect with you here on this podcast. Okay, so we met, and I remember we spoke, and I said we will be speaking many times. And so tell us about Ecobot. and what it is and how you arrived at creating this company.
Great. So Ecobot is a software platform that allows scientists to do their environmental due diligence and natural resources monitoring and assessment work a lot more efficiently. It works on iOS devices out in the field for the field data collection, has some very robust geospatial integrations, which allows us to integrate with Esri. And it's primarily focused on the environmental regulatory space. So federal and state regulators are utilizing it, and also environmental consultants and people that are working with mitigation banking.
So that was a very modest explanation of Ecobot. From what I understand, it is one of the only app-based solutions out there for downloading, analyzing, completing, and submitting environmental assessment forms. Is that right?
Yeah.
So that's a big deal. And so tell us why that is so important.
Well, it's important for the monitoring of the waters of the United States. So all the waters that, streams, lakes, wetlands, estuaries that are critical for not just navigation and anthropogenic use, but also for all of its important roles that it plays in biodiversity and ecosystems.
So I'll go out on a limb and go as far as to say what you essentially do is help minimize the time that it takes in the process to submit an assessment form, get it reviewed, approved, analyzed. And that's a big deal because the sooner we get the response back from the assessment form, you understand what is happening at the wetlands, what is special, what's at risk, et cetera. And so one of the biggest game changers I think Ecobot has been able to put in the marketplace is expediting the capacity for solutions, because you're reducing the time that the form is stuck in the process. Is that correct?
Yep. Yeah, we're saving most companies about 50% of their level of effort.
Wetlands are experiencing a number of stressors, including climate and climate change. Do we have enough information and enough data to understand what the exacerbating stress factor from climate change is?
Now that's something we can potentially open up a little bit more, which is exciting because some of the things that we're doing with like U.S. Fish and Wildlife and Esri and all of our scientists are working on we're creating a massive amount of boots on the ground data. We're not talking about modeling and remote sensing, projecting. We're talking about real humans out making real observations of what's going on in the wetlands. And especially for long-term monitoring sites, you're getting years of data in terms of soil change, hydrology change, vegetation, speciation, diversity, changes across time as well. And so we've got thousands and thousands and thousands of data points from all over the nation that's helping, and will continue to help with an understanding of the complexity of our wetlands and also the roles that they play. But more so than anything, it's real data from on the ground, which then can be utilized for planning purposes, policy purposes, and building better models for the future. So I'm working with a colleague of mine at Esri. Dr. Gina O'Neill, she has worked with creating a model that allows us to predict where our wetlands might be. Well, now we can take real data from boots on the ground, incorporate it into that model and into some of the machine learning part. We can utilize the data of the vegetation, the vegetative infrastructure of those communities in order to create way more informed models that can then help us have an understanding of changes from a modeling and landscape perspective too. So it's like really tying things together between science on the ground and then the geospatial modeling and long-term planning and policy.
Good. One of the things that I also saw with regard to wetlands is that cities are using these areas in their planning for retention ponds and things like that. So just like you said, these are runoff areas for rainfall. And Carsten, as we know, the atmosphere is warming, and it's good, and it has a great ability to store moisture. How's this going to play into it?
Well, I mean, obviously, as you increase the amount of moisture capacity in the atmosphere, your rainstorms are going to get a bit more intense and more frequent. There are going to be places where you're going to have a lot more ability to rain out a lot more precipitation at once. But at the same time, there are also shifts in patterns. So, despite being able to hold more moisture, a lot of places just will not have that moisture to hold, and that goes back into the idea of removing wetlands. These are major sources for evaporating moisture into the atmosphere, and if those are removed, then you simply don't have the moisture in the atmosphere to rain out.
Mm-hmm. So, Jeremy, if we're expecting more rainfall, how can these wetlands be used by city planners more effectively to mitigate, these negative impacts?
I mean, there's a few ways that I think that touches into. Some of them we've already spoken into here. I mean, I think the distribution of velocity of stormwater, from an engineering perspective, is probably one of the most literally impactful that some of these simulated wetlands can create. And I guess the beauty of a simulated wetland is that eventually it's going to morph into at least a naturalized wetland, which may take on more functionality. Then, of course, you've got the pollutant discharge uptake, through phytoremediation that can take place in these locations, and then potentially be harvested out or removed, so that those can be properly taken care of, or put in, changed chemically, or through some process into some innate form. But I think, one of the things that plays in, and Carsten was speaking to this, or alluding to this, and I kind of want to open it up a little bit more, is when you take, a natural wetland ecosystem, especially something that's forested. I mean, I love being able to see the trees in the background of you there, Carsten, because it's a great reminder of that, of like, all of these trees are absorbing the water and, through transpiration, releasing it back to the atmosphere. And through that releasing, they're also releasing volatile organic compounds, which are then able to seed the clouds. And so, the amount of isoprenes or monoterpenes or other organics that these trees are able to exude actually seed the clouds, as a lot of work has been done over that in the last 40 years. Whereas a lot of the transpiration coming from more emergent plants doesn't necessarily have that capability, or a lessened capability. They're releasing less of those gases back into the environment to allow for the seeding of those clouds. And so, as he spoke to, there's some loss in the absorption rate that happens with that. So I think if we're losing green space in cities that are allowing for more of that slow absorption, certainly it's better to have stormwater plans in place that will help absorb some of that. But, based on the science, I think that these need to be built to be eventually forested wetlands where it's appropriate, in order to not only accommodate for stormwater and nutrients, but also to help with that absorption and transpiration of moisture in a way that's more metered out over time, and is more beneficial to the seeding of appropriate storm events for the region.
Are you seeing specific climatic changes inside these wetland areas that you're studying?
I mean, certainly when, we were speaking to latitude before, when we're speaking, I think what we're seeing is a movement north. You see a movement north of species, away from the equator. Things that are more acclimated to the equator are moving north. Things that are more acclimated to temperate zones are moving into the boreal forest. Boreal species are moving up into the Arctic. I mean, these are all things that are trackable, that are measurable. I mean, there's no questioning, that it's happening. So I don't know, I think that answers your question, Neil. I mean,
No, no, for sure. I was just wondering if you were seeing, relating to species, but you're absolutely nailing it on the head with the migration of species. When we don't actually think about that, especially in plants, that plants actually do migrate.
Oh yeah.
So,
Yeah, I'd also add that in that migration, there's also the factor of simply having barriers now in place to that migration where there may not have been in the past. Interstate highways, for example, large urban areas. These can greatly inhibit the ability of these species to find a new habitat.
Or it tends to create habitat more for species that aren't what in ecology we would consider climax species. It's encouraging species that are regenerative or annual or more perennial based plants because they move faster. I mean, we're not just talking about highway and urban barriers, but we're also talking about vast swaths of commercial farming barriers too, that essentially are biodiversity deserts.
with so many wonderful destinations around the world to choose from, a little help can go a long way. Quest Dive Adventures is your premium adventure travel company, offering a wide and diverse selection of destinations to choose from. With dive adventures from the Pacific to the Caribbean and adventure travel from Costa Rica to Africa. Quest Dive Adventures offers packages including flights and accommodations, activities, transfers, diving, and more. Everything to enjoy your perfect vacation. What's your quest?
Wetlands are experiencing a number of stressors, including climate and climate change. Do we have enough information and enough data to understand what the exacerbating stress factor from climate change is?
Now that's something we can potentially open up a little bit more, which is exciting because some of the things that we're doing with like U.S. Fish and Wildlife and Esri and all of our scientists are working on we're creating a massive amount of boots on the ground data. We're not talking about modeling and remote sensing projecting. We're talking about real humans out making real observations of what's going on in the wetlands. And especially for long-term monitoring sites, you're getting years of data in terms of soil change, hydrology change, vegetation, speciation, diversity, changes across time as well. And so we've got thousands and thousands and thousands of data points from all over the nation that's helping, and will continue to help with an understanding of the complexity of our wetlands and also the roles that they play. But more so than anything, it's real data from on the ground, which then can be utilized for planning purposes, policy purposes, and building better models for the future. So I'm working with a colleague of mine at Esri. Dr. Gina O'Neill, she has worked with creating a model that allows us to predict where our wetlands might be. Well, now we can take real data from boots on the ground, incorporate it into that model and into some of the machine learning part. We can utilize the data of the vegetation, the vegetative infrastructure of those communities in order to create way more informed models that can then help us have an understanding of changes from a modeling and landscape perspective too. So it's like really tying things together between science on the ground and then the geospatial modeling and long-term planning and policy.
Good.
Jeremy, we've talked a lot about the number of different stressors that affect wetlands. And we talk about a lot of benefits that the wetlands provide, yet it's underappreciated or perhaps not lesser known how climate change is impacting wetlands. Can you talk a little bit about what you are seeing? And let's just go from there.
Well, I guess, again, like most of what I see is the mobility of rapidly reproducing invasive species, whether those are vegetative based or animals, like, there's that's one aspect of change. I spoke earlier, to see northern species or southern species moving north. I think that the other thing that we can frequently see is the average temperatures of waters that are found in wetlands, especially in emergent wetlands or wetlands that consist primarily of herbaceous species, that the temperatures of those waters are going up, which then makes it harder to biologically process the pollutants and nutrient loads that might be coming into these wetlands. So I think, we're seeing a subtle shift, just as with anything, as we monitor climate change.
Do you think when you think about these stressors, what are some of the significant challenges with regards to data? You talked about temperature, you talked about soil change, speciation, biodiversity. Can you talk a little bit about how good is the available data, and what would you want to have in context of best possible data? Is that out there? Could it be possible? Could we use citizen science to collect information?
I think that there's a fair amount of data that is readily available, both through services as well as in open forums. However, a lot of data sets, as you all probably know from looking at climate science, are pieced together over time and really can use some refinement, which of course requires a lot more resources. So one of the data sets that frequently we lean into in respect to wetland science, at least in the United States, is the National Wetland Inventory produced by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And some of those data sets are very antiquated. Frequently scientists will be out on sites and find wetlands where they're not supposed to exist, or where they're supposed to be wetlands, they no longer exist because of soil movement, because of sediment changes, because of stormwater movement and changes. And so I believe that there's always room for improvement there. I've been in collaboration with Megan Lang, the Chief Scientific Officer with the Fish and Wildlife in respect to the wetland inventory. And like I was speaking to earlier, some of the work I'm doing with my colleague Gina over at Esri is allowing us to refine some of the processes for creating models that will give us better data sets. But I think, again, like when we're dealing with the granularity that is necessary for assessments of when we're looking at things in respect to wetlands, that it's really important that we continue to have this interchange between the actual collection of data in the field that informs those models. And that's where Ecobot plays such a critical role in helping to ascend more biological data and putting it into a format that gives it a geospatial context and allows us to continue to build better models. And so other data sets, I think there's a lot of opportunities for improvement on data sets, and there always will be. And a lot of times it comes down to funding. Where can citizen science come into play? I mean, some things certainly citizen scientists can help out with, from measuring temperatures of water, potentially measuring sediment loads, but I think a lot of ways, there's a lot of things that are very specialized that really require someone with an appropriate background to be able to gather the level of data that would actually give us data schematics with appropriate level of detail that's going to be useful.
All right, guys. Well, thank you very much, Jeremy, for coming in today. We really appreciate your point of view today and helping us understand the role and responsibility of wetlands in the greater understanding of how these affect the climate. We want to wish you the best of success, and also to Ecobot. And I think if anyone wants to hear or learn a bit more about Ecobot, I believe it's www.ecobotapp.com. Is that correct?
That's great. Yep.
Very good. Well, thank you very much today. And we hope to have you back in the future. And maybe we can continue with a different subject. Thank you so much for today.
Appreciate it.
Okay, Carson, let's pivot to the news. And for those of you that are new to listening to the podcast, we do have a newsletter that goes out once a week. And we usually take 2 or 3 articles that are climate related from the current news cycle, and we'll add them to our newsletter, as well as an interesting scientific report that we found that we feel is worth sharing. So if you're interested in signing up for that, so just go to 2degreec.org, and you should find the sign up link there. So Carsten, today I saw a headline that I found was interesting. It was talking about Greenland. And it says, enough ice melted on a single day to cover Florida in 2 inches of water. What is going on?
Well, yeah, and I guess you're in Florida, so this would be relevant for you. It's not actually going to be covering Florida just yet. But yeah, just this past week, something like 8.5 billion tons of ice was reportedly melted off of the Greenland ice sheet in one day, and that's just an incredible amount. If you were to spread that over an area the size of Florida, it would have a depth of several inches, of a couple of inches for sure. But this is part of what is projected and is already happening in terms of sea level rise. Is that these especially in the northern hemisphere, these ice sheets like Greenland and such, and the Arctic winter ice sheets are becoming smaller. They're melting away, and they are contributing to sea level rise. If Greenland itself were to melt entirely, all the ice there were to melt, it would raise sea level by, I believe, about 20 feet or so. Which is pretty significant. But what's even more significant about this rapid rate of melting right now is it's quickly exposing a lot of the darker ice that's underneath the older ice. That the surface layers got a lot of snow on it, very reflective and such. This darker ice underneath is going to be able to absorb a lot more solar radiation, and so accelerate this process even a bit more. So that's a bit alarming, and that may indicate that that melt off is going to happen at a faster rate than the models had originally thought they might.
And we're talking about land ice. We're not talking about floating sea ice, correct?
Correct. This is the ice cap on Greenland, on the landmass of Greenland itself, the glacial ice.
Well, I think definitely interesting to watch with things that are going on. The other headline that I picked out for today was they were talking about Bangladesh battling dengue outbreak and COVID crisis as a double blow. Why was this related to the climate?
Well, in some ways it is, in some ways it isn't. The particular outbreak that they're experiencing right now, which I believe they've got a bit over 2,000 cases so far, and it's just in its early stages, is, it's pretty heavy. It's not quite as bad as they had last year, where they had about 1,500 cases throughout the wet season. And previous year they had quite a lot more cases. But it's a disease that is definitely prevalent in that part of the world. It comes with it's mosquito-borne disease that's it's spread by mosquitoes, which of course are bred in standing pools of water. So any wet place that has mosquitoes is likely to experience these sort of things, and that's really the tie-in to climate in this sense, is that as the temperatures warm in more places, and some places become wetter as a result of climate change, we're likely to see dengue and other insect-borne diseases like dengue spread into places that previously had never experienced them, and where the population may not have any sort of built-up immunity to them, or ability to address them in a effective way.
Yeah, I understand. And this obviously isn't just vector-borne diseases like dengue. We're actually talking about other diseases as well that are not specifically mosquito-borne. But we understand that climate, as it's a warming climate, is allowing the proliferation of these into new areas.
Yeah, and a lot of them are definitely insect-borne. Malaria, Zika, things like that are tied to mosquitoes and such. But for example, cholera is one that's becoming a little bit more prevalent as places are experiencing flooding more frequently, and large areas of standing water where the bacteria grow and can spread those non-insect borne diseases and pathogens.
Well, thanks, Carson. Thanks for giving us some insight there. And to those listening, thank you very much for joining us today for the 2 Degree C Climate Chat. And we hope to see you next time.
Thanks a lot, Neil.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of the 2 Degree C Climate Chat. If you have a question you would like answered, a topic for discussion, or would like to be a guest on the show, please leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your stories and climate journeys. And if you like what you've heard today, please like, subscribe, and comment wherever you hear your podcasts. Thank you to our sponsors and partners without which this podcast is not possible, with special thanks to Seren Media for producing today's episode. To find out more about our partners, please visit our website. And if you'd like to become a sponsor or partner, please email us at podcast@2degreesc.org.